And today we have Dr. Ron Butler, who um, is an ecologist who, for the past 26 years, has been helping to coordinate statewide community science initiatives on Maine's dragonflies, butterflies, bumblebees, and a group new to me, flower flies. He's also co-authored a book on the butterflies of Maine and the Canadian Maritimes and has a similar book on dragonflies and damselflies in the works, which it sounds like is going to be on bookshelves by the end of next year, hopefully. So I'm thrilled that we have Dr. Ron Butler here today with us, and I'm going to hand it off to him. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me. We're going to talk about the Maine and Maritimes, damselflies and dragonflies today. But in the spirit of full disclosure, I have to say that I'm not an entomologist. I'm an animal ecologist, as Suzanne indicated. And I spent the first part of my career um, working on seabirds uh, along the coast of Maine, several field seasons in Newfoundland, and 2 field seasons in Antarctica. And it wasn't really until the mid 90s or so that I switched my research emphasis to, in that case, insects and specifically odonates, that is, damselflies and dragonflies. And since then, I've continued to work not only with odonates, but also with a wide variety of pollinators, including bees, butterflies, wasps, and flower flies. I've been fortunate to be able to collaborate with Maine's Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife on no fewer than 4 statewide citizen science initiatives, starting with the Maine Damselfly and Dragonfly Survey, and finishing that and going on to the Maine Butterfly Survey, following that with the recently concluded Maine Bumblebee Atlas, and now the survey that just began this year and will go on for the next 4 years, the Maine Flowerfly Survey. And so if folks are interested in that, they can email me later, and I'm glad to give out some more information on that. We ran 4 training sessions, Zoom training sessions for that program this spring, and we'll be doing more again next spring. But my focus today is dragonflies and damselflies, to use the stunning photo by my friend Brian Pfeiffer of a blue-faced ringtail to give you a hint as why you should be interested in these fascinating animals. So I always like to place insect groups in context. So if we talk about the historical appreciation of odonates, again, a common term used to refer to dragonflies and damselflies, some of the earliest references that I can find for these guys are the late Bronze Age, about 1500 years before the Christian era, on seal stones, that is, stones that were embedded in wax to indicate the origin of a particular product. 700 years before the Christian ethic, we can find dragonflies mentioned in poetry like Japanese haiku. Uh, this representation was very popular in Japanese feudal culture. You find this on sword hilts and on helmets and on the crests of various samurai families. And the earliest English literature, I actually find it in Roman literature earlier than that, but the earliest English reference that I have is from the 1600s in Francis Bacon's Silva Silarium. So it's historically, people have certainly appreciated or at least given some significance to this group of insects. Uh, the common names for dragonflies really vary depending upon which part of the world you're in. In Western Europe and thus in North America, um, dragonflies tend to, and people tend to pay more attention to dragonflies than they do damselflies, probably because of their size, tend to have kind of a negative connotation. Devil's needle, devil's horse, horse stinger, darning needle was the one that I grew up with. My grandmother was fond of relating the fact that darning needles would sew the lips together of little boys who told the lies. I lived through that nightmare for many years. Uh, but quite frequently, hobgoblin fly, eye stinger, snake killer, devil's steelyard. So a lot of negative connotation in just about Western Europe and thus North America only. So some of the folk myths associated with them in Italy, in terms of popular um, mythos, dragonflies are sent by Satan to bother the unworthy. In Sweden, referred to as the devil's steelyard because a dragonfly circling your head would be weighing your soul to see whether you are worthy. I've already related the US myth about stitching shut the mouths of children, but switch cultures dramatically, like going to Asia, and you find a very different association with these guys. In Japan, the spirit of success, harbinger of rich harvests. Uh, Native American uh, symbolism associated with magic, shamans. Uh, this is a drawing of a Navajo sand painting because the dragonfly, you can see the two sets of wings here, was associated with pure water. The Zuni, again, associated supernatural powers with dragonflies. In Tahiti, a little bit more negative, a familiar of the god Hero, which was the god of thieves. So dragonflies apparently distracted people while thieves were breaking into their dwellings and stealing their goods. In terms of utility, since we as humans always seem to need to put utility on groups of organisms, dragonflies are consumed as food, as are many other insects, 13 or 1400 species actually, in various African, South American, Asian countries. Okay, so there are actually recipes for how to prepare dragonflies. Usually we're talking about the larvae, not the adults. In a number of countries, dragonflies have purported medicinal utility. So getting rid of things like fever or headaches or indigestion. And in some indigenous cultures, the wings of very ornate dragonflies are used as decoration. And of course, that sort of carries right over in contemporary American culture, and I'll just deal with that, as dragonflies are associated with all sorts of things, including art. We probably all see dragonfly coffee cups. I have a whole bunch of them in my cupboard. Lamps, pubs, wines, ales, boats are named after dragonflies. You can find all sorts of dragonfly dishes, and even dragonfly body art is very popular. So obviously, this group of insects has had a profound cultural impact on societies around the world. Let's talk a little bit about the big picture in terms of insect evolution. We know that from the fossil record that insects appeared over 400 million years ago. And we know that one particular group of insects, the griffin flies, which, by the way, are often represented as dragonflies, they are not, but they are related to that line that gave rise to dragonflies. They appear about 325 million years ago, and they were very large compared to contemporary dragonflies. The oxygen concentration of the atmosphere was much higher then and would support the unique respiratory system that insects have and dragonflies have in particular, and allow this kind of gigantism. We know that the first dragonflies don't appear until about 300 million years ago. So this is an ancient group of organisms, and I want to put on this chart the hallmark that we all associate with prehistoric animals, that is dinosaurs. Note that dinosaurs appear 70 million years after dragonflies. So dragonflies were already ancient before dinosaurs put in appearance. Insects don't leave a very good fossil record, but of the insects that do, dragonflies leave the best record. Their wings tend to last through all sorts of uh, deformations associated with the fossilization process. So we can find some very good specimens, both as impressions. You can see this particular fossil is very easy to recognize, as we can see here a contemporary family of dragonflies known as the clubtails. You can see that club very well represented in this fossil that's 120 million years old. And in the more recent ambers, we have perfectly preserved three-dimensional insects that resemble almost identically the extant species in those families that exist today. So we have a really good fossil record for dragonflies and damselflies, which we don't have for many insect groups. So in this order of insects, Odonata, which means toothed, we have over 6,400 known species on the planet. So this is not a large order compared to beetles, for example, where we have 400,000 species. But this order is broken down into two major suborders, the Anisoptera, which are the dragonflies, and the Zygoptera, which are the damselflies. Now, there is one other very small suborder containing only two known species, the Anisozygoptera, and these little guys have sort of characteristics of both of the other suborders, but it's very small, and anything you're going to see in North America is going to belong to one of the two big suborders. I'm often asked how to tell a difference between the two, dragonflies versus damselflies. And in fact, some people think damselflies are baby dragonflies, which is not the case. Adult insects really don't grow. If you see a small adult insect, that's as big as it's going to get. Okay. So size is one good way in North America to tell the difference. Damselflies tend to be smaller, and they tend to have more narrow abdomens. The abdomens of dragonflies tend to be more robust. Asymmetric wings. In dragonflies, the forewing is a little longer and a little narrower than the hind wing. In damselflies, the wings are much more symmetric, so when they're held together, you really can't see the difference between the hind wing and the forewing. The wing position is also important. Dragonflies all rest with their wings open. Damselflies, for the most part, a few minor exceptions, and I'll show you later, tend to rest with their wings folded over the abdomen. And that has to do with the wing architecture. If we look at dragonfly wings, we can see the base is very broad. These things are not meant to fold, whereas the damselfly wings are what we call petiolate. They narrow down, and that allows them to be folded over the rear part of the animal. Again, just The exception is this little family. They certainly don't rest with their wings out, but they don't fold them completely over their abdomen either. They kind of hold them at a 45-degree angle that you can see here. And these are the spread wings. So that's a kind of damselfly that is very common in North America. Eyes. Dragonflies have proportionally the largest eyes in the of all the insects. Damselflies have very large eyes too, but not proportionally as large compared to the size of the head as dragonflies do. So you can see all of the head that's exposed here, the two compound eyes and the three simple eyes. This guy has three simple eyes too, but the amount of exposed head is really small by contrast. So very large eyes. Like caddisflies and mayflies and stoneflies, dragonflies have aquatic larvae. So the first part, and actually the longest part of their life, is spent in water. And if we look at the families that we have in Maine and the Maritimes, there you can very easily pick out the two suborders. The zygopterans, the damselflies, will have these caudal appendages, which are actually gills. And you don't see that in dragonflies because the gills of dragonflies are what we call rectal gills. They're actually inside of the rectum. So, and I would also say that damselflies tend to be much more tubular in terms of the abdomen as compared to most of the dragonflies, with the exception of the darters, which can also have that long abdomen, but nowhere near as narrow. All of these guys are predators. They feed on a wide variety of invertebrate and vertebrate prey with a really unique in that only the Odonata have this in their larval form appendage that they keep retracted under the head. These guys are mostly ambush predators, and as they slowly approach prey, this thing will shoot out and grab their prey. You can see this poor fish has been grabbed, and same in this representation here. No other insects have this particular adaptation. This is unique to dragonflies and damselflies. These guys will go through a number of molts in the larval stage, anywhere from 8 to 17, depending upon the species. The average is 12, before they finally will crawl out of the water in the final larval stage and go through their emergence from an aquatic larva to a terrestrial adult. And they literally will emerge out of this exoskeleton, do a kind of a forward flip and grab onto it, and will then start pumping out the wings in a process that may take, depending upon the humidity, anywhere from a couple of hours to the better part of a day before they're able to fly away. What's left behind is the last larval exoskeleton, referred to as an exuvia. In terms of their morphology, dragonflies or damselflies are built pretty much the same. They have three major units: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen, which has 10 segments. The head basically contains the feeding apparatus and the forepart of the nervous system and the all-important eyes. The thorax, as is the case with all insects, is the motor unit. It's where the three sets of legs attach and the two sets of wings in those insects that still have wings. And the abdomen is really about digestion, circulation to some extent, excretion, and of course, reproduction. I do want to talk just a little bit about vision since it's so important in both damselflies and dragonflies. These guys have these huge, as I've said, compound eyes, and each of those eyes can have up to 25 to 30,000 of these little uh, facets, which are called ommatidia. And each of these things is essentially an eye by itself, an image forming eye. Okay, it has its own lens, it has its own sort of equivalent of a retina, and each of these ommatidia feed into the central nervous system. And the vast size of particularly the dragonfly eye, gives it almost a 365, 60-degree view. Their one blind spot tends to be below and behind them. They have excellent visual acuity and can see not only the visible spectrum that we can see, but also polarized light and ultraviolet light. And if we look at the dragonfly eye in particular, we can see that all of these facets, these ommatidia, are not the same. And in some cases, these will be colored differently, but in other cases, you have to look really closely. I'm going to show you a larger. So this area of the eye, you can see that the ommatidia are actually larger. And so in dragonflies, we refer to this as the fovea. And the fovea is very important in terms of the way these guys as adults hunt prey. Because when we look at predators, we generally find two major categories of predators. Ambush predators, think of any big cat, and pursuit predators, any canid, like wolves or wild dogs or foxes. Dragonflies are neither. Dragonflies are intercept predators. And remember, we're dealing with critters that are 300 million years old. They've had time to perfect this in terms of evolution. And so a dragonfly, like a skimmer, sitting on a branch like this and seeing a potential prey item will basically, in 1/3 of a second, decide whether to pursue or not to pursue. Think about 1/3 of a second. How many of those have gone by in my speech just now? They will then, in 1/10 of a second, plot an intercept course for that flying prey before they launch. And again, they're not trying to chase it. They're going to intercept it instead. And that's what's going on here. So why is this important? Well, let's consider the success rate of predators. Predators are not very successful. If you look at the number of times predators actually try to get a prey item and their actual success rate, it can be quite slow. Quite low. So tigers, 5%. Domestic cats, better. They're about a third. Third of the times your average tabby, which is why they should be indoor cats, are outdoors. They're successful. Cheetahs, which hunt like dogs, by the way, cheetahs are not ambush predators, they're pursuit predators, have one of the highest success rates, but it's still just better than half. What about our intercept predators? Almost every time a dragonfly goes after something, it gets it. Okay. Again, 300 million years of evolution. Talk a little bit about odonate flight. They, of course, have two wings, and unlike the wings of many of our four-winged flyers, the wings move independently. They're highly maneuverable. They allow dragonflies to hover, fly forward, fly backward, fly sideways. Now, in the literature, you will see references to dragonflies flying up to 50 miles an hour. None of the actual studies support that speed limit. Uh, Probably the fastest dragonflies fly at maybe 35 miles an hour, but the average dragonfly does not fly that fast. It's more in the range of 15 to 20 miles an hour. Damselflies, on the other hand, tend not to fly much. They're considered weak flyers. That's kind of a misnomer. It's just their biology is geared more to the way they hunt, which tends to be what we call gleaning. They kind of go around looking for things that are perched. Um, when we talk about insect migration, we often think of monarch butterflies, right? Well-known migrants. Um, Most people are not quite aware of the fact that the monarchs that leave New England and head south in the winter are not the same monarchs that come back. Monarchs are generational migrants. It often takes 3 and sometimes 4 generations for that return flight. There are actually quite a few butterflies that are generational migrants. And as it turns out, there are quite a few dragonflies that are generational migrants. And one of the most common ones that we have in New England is the common green darner, which you may have seen. And that darner does, again, a southern migration in the fall, uh, produces an overwinter generation in the spring, and a third and sometimes fourth generation are the ones that we see arrive back in Maine and the Maritimes, generally in early May, in May. And again, there are a number of dragonflies that do this. The generational migration of the common green darner is remarkable, but in no way compares this critter, which is called the wandering glider. And you can see those. I've been actually seeing them around my deck just this past week. Uh, these guys can do a generational migration of over 8,000 miles. And a spectacular one that goes from Central Asia down through the Indian subcontinent, across the ocean to Africa, and then back. But again, not a single generation. So dragonflies also do this kind of migration. And some other insects do that, by the way, too. Uh, Sex differences. How do you tell between male and female dragonflies and damselflies? In some cases, their coloration is very similar. It's very difficult to use color as a means, not always, but and you have to really look more closely. Because the second major evolutionary innovation shown by dragonflies and damselflies and no other insect is in males the existence of secondary genitalia. So the primary genitalia of males and females is located back here. But males have secondary genitalia located up here near the junction of the abdomen with the thorax. If you see some kind of little structure here, that means it's a male. Now, there are other ways to tell too. Females tend to have more robust abdomens. They lack this particular secondary genitalia, and their terminalia are different than males, but that's an easy way to tell. In some cases, there are discrete color differences. Okay, this is a very common damselfly in Maine and the Maritimes, the eastern forktail. Males are colored this way. Newly emerged females are this color, and they gradually turn that color as older females. So clear sexual dimorphism between males and females in terms of coloration. Both damselflies and dragonflies who are mating will form what we call tandems. Uh, the dragonfly links up a little bit differently than the damselfly, but basically it will be the male in front holding the female this way. So this will always be the female. The way that works, you need to really closely examine the terminal appendages at the end of the abdomen of the male and the morphology of the female, where her thorax plates merge, her prothorax and her metasthorax. Let me show you what I mean. So this is a bunch of damselfly males. Each one is a different species. And notice that each of these structures is different. So I want you to think of those as keys, because the lock is here on the female. This is the middle section of the female's thorax. Here's the front section. And right here is this weirdly shaped plate. And that's the lock. And the male has to have the right key to fit in this particular lock in order to fly in tandem. So the wrong structure, for example, this won't actually fit well here. It has to be that particular male has the right key, so to speak. Those are actually called cerci, to fit the female's mesothoracic plates. And that keeps hybridization to a minimum in terms of interbreeding of damselflies in the wild. So whether you're a dragonfly or a damselfly, males basically grab a hold of females in this fashion, but females can control copulation. Because unless the female's willing to bring her primary sex apparatus around in this position we call the wheel to contact the male's secondary sex apparatus, there is no copulation. And males will haul females around in tandem for a while, but if there's no successful copulation, they'll release them and go looking for another date. So females control. As is the case with the number of insects, females store sperm. And so the last male that mates with a female tends to fertilize most of the eggs. And that means that in many species, males tend to guard females that they've copulated with while the females oviposit. And you can see here in this pair of globally rare scarlet bluets, Maine and New Hampshire are the center of the entire global range for this particular damselfly, which is only known from about 4 or 5 states. That's an entire global range. The male is keeping a hold of the female, so another male can't grab onto her. Well, the female is actually slitting a hole in the underside of this, looks like water shield, and depositing an egg in that slit. And so mate guarding is very common in many species, either through direct contact, or in the case of these little eastern amberwings, the male is hovering around the female while she oviposits and will chase other males away. We do have in some species cases where females do oviposit without being guarded by males. And in some cases, females really go deep to lay their eggs and often drag the hapless males who are guarding down with them, although often males are tempted to release at this point. So what comes of an egg? Well, what hatches out of an egg is something we call a prolarva. And that prolarva usually pretty rapidly undergoes its first metamorphosis into a true larval form. Now, depending upon the species and where you are on the planet, the egg may overwinter. The prolarva may overwinter, or one of the larval stages overwinters. The cycle then continues. In terms of species richness in the United States, what we find is East Coast states tend to have more damselflies and dragonflies than West Coast states, with the exception of Texas, which has more species than anybody else, largely because of the prevalence and diversity of wetlands that we have in the eastern part of the country relative to the western part. That said, the northern hemisphere is pauperate almost in terms of dragonflies and damselfly species. We find most of them, 90% of the species richness tends to be in the southern hemisphere, which is not a surprise. So worldwide, as I said, more than 6,400 species. More species get discovered every year, particularly in Asia. 471 species known in the US and Canada, 168 in the Maritimes and the state of Maine. In Maine, we have 6 families of dragonflies and 3 families of damselflies. And I'm not going to go through all 168 of Maine and Maritimes, but I want to give you some feeling for the diversity in each of these families. So the first group are what we call the broadwings, and they're very beautiful metallic species. Probably the one most people are familiar with is the ebony jewelwing. In fact, the 3 jewel wings are called that, whereas the American ruby spot on the lower right is just referred to as a broadwing. I talked about the spread wings. That's the second family that characteristically have their wings folded back, but at a 45-degree angle, as opposed to damselflies, which fold theirs over their abdomen this way. And we have a number of species of spread wings in Maine and the Maritimes. Everybody's familiar with pond damselflies. It's commonly called bluets, although maybe not as familiar as you think you are. We have lots of species of bluets, and some of them are easy to tell apart based on their color, and some of them are very difficult to tell apart. We also have bluets that aren't, well, blue. We have the scarlet bluet, we have the orange bluet, we have the vesper bluet because it tends to come out just about 4, 5, 6 o'clock this time of year, about vespers. We have bluets that are actually violet. So lots of variation there, this group. The pond damsels are the largest damselfly family on the planet. The darners. Everybody's familiar with these. They tend to have a dark background with blue and or green coloration, often with stripes on the thorax. These guys tend to be hangers. They hang on vegetation when they perch, and they don't perch as often. And again, we have lots of variation in this group. It's fairly well represented in Maine and the Maritimes. And again, you can see that kind of consistent pattern, dark background, with a couple of exceptions, notably the common green darner. And this spectacular species, the largest species we have in Maine and the Maritimes, with the comet darner, with this brilliant red-orange abdomen, really easy to pick out when you happen to see. The next dragonfly family are the clubtails. So called because many of the species have this club at the end of the tail. This is one of my favorites, Hygenius brevistylis, called commonly the dragon hunter because one of its key prey items is other dragonflies. But you can see these club tails, again, tend to be horizontal perchers. They all tend to have this dark background with greens and yellows, with a few exceptions. And very common, especially there's one species in particular, the spiny, the black-shouldered spiny leg, which often lands on your boat or on you. when you're on the dock or something on your hat this time of year. I have one very small family with only three species in the region called the spiketails. They're all dark with these vivid yellow markings. I tend to find them more around rivers, streams than ponds and lakes. The genus of these guys has recently been changed from Cordulacaster to Zerena, so that these pictures are a little bit out of date in terms of their labeling. And an even smaller family in this region, the cruisers. Both of them are, this one says Didymops here, but they're both Macromian. Again, this is one of the earliest emerging dragonflies that I happen to see in Maine. The emeralds. This family, so called because many, but not all species have those emerald green eyes. Just to give you a better picture of that. These guys, several of them are very early season species. And as you can see, some of them don't have that emerald green eye, but many of them do. And many of them also have metallic coloration on the thorax and sometimes the abdomen. This particular one, the ringed bog hunter, is actually officially on our threatened list in the state of Maine. And lastly, we have the skimmers, the largest family in Maine and in the world. And these guys include some of the very brightly colored dragonflies and damselflies we see, including the white faces, so-called because they have this porcelain white face. But a variety of them have different colored bodies and different colored wings, and hence are usually pretty easy for people to start learning to identify because of the very specific nature of the wing color patterns. This is the only one that we have in Maine and the Maritimes with a uniformly orange wing. And it's the second smallest species of dragonfly in this region. These are blue. This is actually the smallest dragonfly. This dragonfly is about this big. It's actually smaller than many damselflies in terms of body length. Some of our pennants with wonderfully colored wings, very easy to pick out. In the group that tends to be late summer and fall, and these are our meadowhawks. We have 7 or 8 species of these, maybe even more. One of them is actually black, but this species right here is probably one of the last ones you see in the fall. I found one of these guys 4 days before Thanksgiving, sunning itself on a leaf next to the ice that was forming on the little pond where it was located. So where do we find damselflies and dragonflies? Any place you have wetlands, you will find these guys. Okay. So streams, bogs, lakes, rivers, fens, seeps, marshes, salt marshes. There's some salt marsh specialists. So that's their breeding habitat. That's where you're going to find them. In terms of prevalence, the species richness is highest around lakes and ponds and lowest around seeps and brackish environments. There are relatively few brackish specialists. So any place you've got a lake or a pond with lots of floating and emergent vegetation, you're going to have flies and dragonflies, all other things being equal. We have 2 species that are threatened in Maine, 17 species that are of special concern, and 8 species that are listed that have greatest conservation concern. So these are officially listed by the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, and threatened and special concern species have actual legal protection under Maine state law. Species of greatest conservation concern are ones that are borderline going into the special concern. We don't have any that are on the endangered species list for the federal government in Maine. Ecological significance. I always like to talk about that. Remember, we're almost dealing with two different groups of animals. As a larva, we're dealing with aquatic critters. As an adult, we're dealing with terrestrial critters. And so what we find is in aquatic food webs, these guys are a very important predator. They eat all sorts of things, from worms to insects to small amphibians, small fish. But they're also prey for all sorts of aquatic organisms, including fish and turtles and crayfish and aquatic birds. Okay. Of course, fly fishermen are well familiar with this, since they design a lot of their flies to mimic either larvae or adults. But these guys are equally important in terrestrial systems, where they're really important predators. All dragonfly and damselfly adults are predators, but they're also prey for all sorts of things, for birds, for fish, for other predatory insects, for arachnids, and so on. And I just want to emphasize, remember, they were here before dinosaurs. Okay, so they were also important for probably many of the pterosaurs, the smaller pterosaurs. And just because you're an adult doesn't mean you're safe from aquatic predators. So ovipositing adults are often targeted by both fish and frogs who will come out of the water after. The other important function from our perspective of odonates are their use as biological indicators of the integrity of freshwater systems. And that's because of their roles in both wetland and terrestrial food webs. But it's also because of their reliance on nearshore aquatic plant communities, which they use for egg laying, for larval habitat. That's where they're growing up, right? So really important in terms of the integrity of those aquatic plant communities that lots of people want to get rid of in front of their cottages. But equally important are the shoreline terrestrial plant communities, the riparian communities, because that's where a lot of these guys end up feeding as adults, roosting for the night, sheltering when it rains. So really important indicators of the quality of wetlands. You have a healthy dragonfly community, you have probably a healthy wetland. And there are some species that are actually sensitive to contaminants in the water. So again, good biological indicators of wetland habitat quality. So I'm always asked about this, and I'd like to kind of wrap up things with two things. In the early part of this century, we can say that now, a bunch of papers started coming out indicating that insect populations were in decline. And that was followed by that famous New York Times 2018 article on the insect apocalypse. And so I get asked about the insect apocalypse in odonates all the time. And this, of course, was followed by a number of both scientific books and popular books on the insect crisis. And so the question is, are insects in decline? And I'm going to answer it this way. There are any number of studies now that you can go and look where people look at large data sets from lots of different studies at particular groups of insects. I'm just going to pick on odonates here because that's what we're talking about. And I'm going to the International Union for Conservation of Nature database and looking at their figures. Okay, and I've highlighted those figures for odonates, and what they find is about a little over a third of all odonate species that they have data on are declining, and about 13% of those are threatened. That is not as high as some of these figures, which you can see 60 here, right? Dr. Frank Drummond has done a study of uh, a number of insect groups in Maine, and his research suggested that 21 of 35 species for which he had enough data to do an analysis indicated a decline in abundance. So here's a species of skimmer, and here's a darner species going back to the 1800s, terminating here in 2020. I will say that Dr. Drummond and I have recognized the fact that historical data is not necessarily equivalent to contemporary data because of the nature of collecting that was done. So there may be some biases associated with historical data. So what does that tell us about the whole insect apocalypse? Declines in some groups are clear, particularly pollinators. A number of pollinators are in serious decline. Is this a pattern worldwide? The way I would have answered that 10 years ago is different than the way I'll answer it today. Increasingly, it appears that's the case. Is that true of all insect orders? No. In some cases, there are winners. As some things decline, other things that compete with them are increasing, at least now. But I think there are more losers than there are winners right now. Unfortunately, this is a really complex issue. Historical data are often poor. Insect populations can fluctuate wildly from year to year for a variety of reasons. And the trends within populations can be different in different species, in the same species, in different regions, in the same species, in the same region, in different habitats. And so we have to be aware of the fact, my cat is demanding second lunch, that there are multiple drivers of declines. And if you want to read an interesting paper on this, there's a paper by Wagner et al. In 2021 where they go through all of this. And of course, all of this is being complicated by climate change. And so in Maine, we have tended to focus on key groups of insects. And right now, we're focusing our attention on flower flies. But back to dragonflies and damselflies, what I will tell you is in the United Kingdom, a neat little study has shown that vis-a-vis climate change, that there has been a northward shift in about 25 species ranges of dragonflies or damselflies, and that they, in 35 species, they're now emerging earlier than they have historically. And we can see some indicators of that even here in Maine, because in the last decade, we've seen 5 more southern species now appear in the state. In terms of conservation concerns in Maine, I think the big one is shoreline habitat disturbance. I've already talked about the importance of aquatic vegetation and equally the importance of shoreline vegetation for healthy odonate populations. Public access and water quality are certainly important. Runoff from both pesticides and herbicides are important. And climate change is moving the goalposts on everything, as it turns out. and unfortunately introduced species, not necessarily introduced species of dragonflies, I'll talk about that, but introduced species of plants, other kinds of competitors, other kinds of parasites, other kinds of pathogens. I also get asked about mosquito control. There's no evidence that using dragonflies controls mosquitoes, except in cattle troughs. Uh, so communities that are importing from southern states dragonfly larvae basically are probably harming the existing dragonfly populations that have already colonized those wetlands. So importing new damselfly and dragonfly larvae does not, there's no evidence that it works. First of all, it may alter the balance of those systems. It may introduce competitors for native species. And I always have to remind people, we refer to these guys as mosquito hawks. Dragonflies eat anything. They eat anything. Show me a mosquito or fly there. All I see is butterflies and bees. Okay. Food habits analysis show that mosquitoes are actually a small percentage of the diet of many of these guys. They do eat them. They do eat some biting flies, but almost anything is prey to these guys. I'll also remind you that it's not legal to bring these guys into the state without specific authorization from inland fisheries. All right, I'm going to wrap this up very quickly. Um, I often get asked about books for dragonflies and damselflies. If I was going to own just one book in the Northeast or Eastern United States, it would be Dennis Paulson's book. He's got both damselflies and dragonflies and everything you could ever want to know about for the entire East Coast. If you live on the West Coast, he's got one for that. If I was going to own a second book on dragonflies, Ed Lamb's book on dragonflies had the most marvelous paintings of every dragonfly species north of the Mexican border. It's absolutely wonderful. If you live in almost any region of the country, you can find a specific guide to your region now. And the one that we're coming out with, and I don't know if this is going to be the cover because the publisher decides on the cover, it should be out late next year. We'll cover Maine and the Maritime provinces, but any area of the country pretty much has its own. You can also usually find a website for almost any region in the country. I maintain this one for Maine, but most regions will have one now. I get asked about phone apps. Dragonfly ID for either Android or iOS. It's free and really pretty good. There are other kinds of like insect, picture insect and lens and so forth. I think the one to seek, I like the iNaturalist app. That's a fairly good one. You can always go to iNaturalist. I just went to iNaturalist, entered Maine, Clubtails, and basically show you all the pictures of everything that's been recorded on iNaturalist, not necessarily everything that's in the state, but it's another easy way to see what's about in terms of trying to identify. All right, I can say I'm out of time. There's all sorts of people I should acknowledge, but there's only one group that I am going to take the time to acknowledge, and that's my several decades of wonderful UMF research students who have followed me through marshes and swamps and up the sides of mountains and across rivers as we surveyed for dragonflies and butterflies and tiger beetles and grasshoppers and all the other kinds of surveying work that we've done. It's, their collaboration with me that's made my success possible. With that, I'm more than willing to entertain questions. And if you're shy, you can always email me at butler@maine.edu and I'll answer your questions via email. That's what I've got today.
Thank you so much, Ron. Does anyone have questions? You can just unmute yourself for a small group. I have a question to start us off. I was wondering, you might have said this, but how long do do dragonflies live in the adult stage?
I didn't say. So damselflies, probably a couple of weeks.
Okay.
Dragonflies, um, probably 1 to a couple of months. Uh, the generational migrants may go a few months more. Um, but for most of these species, the majority of their lifespan is spent in the larval stage. So, for example, there are a couple of European species that may spend 5 or more years as a larva and only a month or two as an adult. So the adult stage, and by the way, that's typical of many insects. The larval stage tends to be longer than the adult stage.